You're listening to episode 127 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Michael de Wiebe joins us to speak about a 6-year study of mindfulness. If you're listening to this podcast and find value and insights from what is shared here, know that this is made possible from your generosity and the generosity of others like you. I want to thank those of you who are making monthly donations to keep this podcast going. And if you're not yet, please take a moment, go to presentmomentmindfulness.com and click on Make a Donation. One-time or especially monthly donations show you value this work, which can't happen without you. Thank you for your help, your support, and your kind generosity. One of the many challenges to doing good research involving human behavior is what the effects of a given intervention are over time. Is what's being seen a long-term change, or just an indication of efficacy only while a given program is in progress? Longitudinal studies help to address this very question, and today's guest has been involved with this problem, appropriately, for years. Michael de Wiebe is a senior advisor at the Norwegian Center for the Health Services. He's a medical doctor and family therapist. He has extensive background in general practice and family therapy, and is a supervisor in family medicine. He's worked on quality improvement of health services since 1998. He's practiced mindfulness from his youth and took an MBSR instructor course at the Center for Mindfulness in 2002. He has developed and researched methods of mindfulness training and stress management, and has developed instructional materials for this. He's taught this at the college level since 2003, and held courses for many different health institutions. He has completed a PhD studying mindfulness training for medical and psychology students in a 2-center randomized trial with long-term follow-up. In 2007 through 8, he ran an instructor course for mindfulness teachers at a university hospital in the north of Norway. Our guest today is Michael de Wiebe. Michael, welcome to the podcast. Very glad to have you here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be in.
So I was so fascinated when I first saw a link in my Google Alerts feeds about this mindfulness study that was longitudinal and went over several years. And as you and I are talking, that's very uncommon. It's very hard to do. So I'm very glad to be speaking with you. Let's begin by just having you tell us about your background.
Yes, I live in Norway, and I'm a grandfather to 2 children that I love very much, and that have taught me perhaps more about mindfulness than all the rest that I've been doing. I started actually becoming interested in yoga and meditation when I was 17 years old. At that time, I had a difficult period in my life, and I was looking for something that could make me feel better. As I see it now, it was sort of a kind of existential crisis. I was wondering about all the difficult questions in
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
And then I read a book, The Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. And I was fascinated by his sort of development path. And I went to the bookstore in the little town that I lived in Norway, and they didn't have many self-help books. This was in '67.
Mm-hmm.
But there was one book there called Yoga and Health. And I bought that. And it had a 6-month program in yoga and meditation. And so I did that and have continued since.
Started on your own at 17 doing this. That's amazing. So as time went on, did you find other people to practice with? How did that grow?
When I finished school, I went to Cardiff in the UK to study medicine. And I joined a Zen meditation group while I was studying. And I also kept up my yoga practice. And then I came back, and after a few years in hospital, I entered a family practice. And I realized then that I wasn't really educated to help the people that came to me.
Mm.
Because very few of the patients came with clear-cut biological problems
Mm-hmm.
that I could analyze, diagnose, and treat,
Mm.
and they would be well again.
Yeah.
We know in Norway that 90% of health care services are given to people with chronic illnesses.
Mm-hmm.
And what I experienced was that what brought them to the doctor was mainly anxiety for what they were going through, the life events they were facing, or the illnesses they had or thought they had.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, I had for many years been working on my own anxiety. And I thought maybe these simple exercises could help the patients.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started teaching patients simple, what I now would call mindfulness practice.
And it's interesting. So at this point, because this echoes very strongly of another story of another researcher we know as John Kabat-Zinn, you hadn't yet run across John's work at the Center for Mindfulness. You were doing this on your own.
Yes. So then I started teaching patients in groups, and I experienced that they had really benefited from it. And after about 10 years of doing that, I wondered whether I was the only one that was doing this, because my colleagues were not interested. Nobody talked about that in the 80s and early 90s in Norway.
Yeah.
But when internet came, I searched the internet and found the Center for Mindfulness, and I also found some other centers, and I wanted to go off on a retreat. And I went on a 3-month silent retreat at Gaia House
Uh-huh.
in 91. And that after that, it sort of matured my ambition of working more with this also in my practice.
Mm-hmm.
And so after having found that there were other people doing it, I talked to a surgeon in Norway that I knew had been to Kabat-Zinn in the 90s. And he said, yeah, it's a good place. And so uh, I applied for a grant from the Medical Association in Norway, and they gave me a 3-month grant to go to Massachusetts and study as an intern. So in 2002, I spent 3 months at the Center for Mindfulness. At that time, Kabat-Zinn was away those 3 months. So it was Saki Santorelli who were running the institute. But I later had the privilege of inviting Kabat-Zinn to Norway because we were doing some conferences on mindfulness in Norway. So I got to meet him later. But after I had done those 3 months, I wanted to bring mindfulness into medical practice. And I thought, how can I do that in Norway? How can I not just do it on my own, in my own practice, but how can I bring it in? And I thought I had to use the methods used in the medical field. I had to use the scientific methods. So in 2003, I applied for a quality grant from the Medical Association in Norway. And I got a grant. I was quite surprised to do a randomized control trial with 150 patients that were suffering from chronic illnesses and stress. And I had 50 of them waiting for 6 months, while the 100 I gave an 8-week MBSR course to. And then after I had followed them up for 6 months, the waitlist group was measured again on subjective health complaints and quality of life. And they were then given the course. And what I wanted to show was that it was not the intention of signing up that was the active ingredient. And after 6 months waiting, there were no changes in subjective health complaints or quality of life. But the waitlist group had the same effect of the courses as the 100 first patients. And I published this in the Norwegian Medical Journal, and was actually awarded a quality prize for the study.
Good. I was going to ask how that was received, because I really like this idea of removing as the active ingredient the interest in taking the course. And that's one of the challenges, is wait list is often, it's not an active intervention. No. So what are some other things you might be able to remove from the table in doing good science? Fascinating. Well, good. I'm glad you had that. So then what happened?
Then what happened was that at that time, I had started working on quality improvement of healthcare services. And I had started working for the government in Norway for a knowledge center for health services. And at a Christmas party, I was introduced to a professor in social medicine, and he asked me, "What are you really interested in?" And I said, "What I'm interested in is bringing mindfulness into medical education." Because I myself, when I studied, had really benefited from it. And I saw that a lot of my fellow students were stressed out and didn't have a very good time. So I said, that's what I really want. And then he said something to me. He said, oh, that's so important. I have taught medical students for 30 years, and they get so much on the factual knowledge and so little on personal development.
Mm-hmm.
And he said something that I think is really wise. He said, if you want to be a skilled worksman, you need two things. You need to know a subject, and you need to develop yourself as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And so we talked together, and we decided to set up the study of students. And he said to me, you ought to do this as a PhD because then it will get more credit. And I was already more than 60 years old, so for me it wasn't it wasn't important. But I thought, well, if that's what it takes, I will do that. And so we set it up, and we got a grant from the Medical Association again. And we set up the study to be a multi-center study, different instructors, and we also included psychology students. So a third of them were psychology students, and 2/3 were medical students. And it was interesting because when I started out in Oslo, I approached both the medical dean and the dean of the psychology department. This was in 2008. And I asked them if there were any teachers that were interested and that I could cooperate with when getting to know the students and introduce the study to them. And both places, they said, no, there are no teachers interested in this. But you can get 15 minutes with all the student representatives, and if they say yes, you can run the study. So I got to meet the representatives for 15 minutes, and I told them in 5 minutes what it was about. And then we did a 5-minute exercise, and then I asked them for their comments for the last 5 minutes. And they all said, everybody should have this.
Wonderful.
So I got a go ahead, and we then recruited from the second and third semester of the 12 semester study in psychology, clinical psychology and medicine. And the reason why we did the third semester for the psychology students was that a lot of the students come into the class after the first 2 terms. They've taken the year somewhere else. And then we recruited about 40% of the total amount we could recruit, which was 700. And we randomized them. We told them that this, I introduced it at the start of a lecture they had. So I had about 10 minutes to introduce the whole study for them. And I handed out an information sheet, and I said they could enter the website and read about it. And if they agreed to participate, they knew that they would be either in the control group, which meant that 6 years down the line, they would be offered the same course.
Yeah.
1 year after they qualified. And if they were in the intervention group, they would get the intervention. which was an abbreviated MBSR course. So it was a 7-week course. And the reason why we abbreviated it was we did a focus group interview with student representatives and asked them, what would it take for the students to keep this up and to attend? And it was outside of student hours, so it meant they had to want to do it. And we reduced the 2.5-hour sessions to 1.5 hour. We reduced the number of weekly sessions to 6 plus an all-day session in week 7. And we reduced the home requirements for practice to 30 minutes. And then we ran the courses. I ran them in Oslo, and in the university in the north of Norway, it was a psychology student that had also been to Massachusetts, who was the instructor. So I didn't have anything to do with the interventions in Tromsø. And then we set up a protocol, and the protocol was online. And all the students were given a code, which we didn't know. It was a technician at the Knowledge Center who had the code. So we were unaware of who were answering or what the, and we just had the anonymous file.
Right. So a double-blinded study.
It's a not double-blinded in the sense that the students were not blinded to the intervention. Because you can't do that. You know if you are getting a mindfulness intervention or if you're in the waiting group. So you can't blind that, but you can blind the assessment. So we did that. And we blind the randomization. So it was only the technician who knew and who sent out telling the students, you are part of the intervention group or you are in the control group. And then we set up an internet protocol that consisted of about 209 questions, to be exact. And they filled this in before randomization, after the course, 1 year after, 2 years after, 4 years after, and 6 years after. And the only other thing we did was that once a term, we sent out a reminder to the ones that had taken the course that they could attend a refresh, a booster session. And about a third of the students, a bit more than a third, between a third and a half, the students attended 1 or more booster sessions.
So I'm very curious as you describe this study, and thank you for doing good science and blinding the results so that there's not this was in my class.
Yes.
Thank you so much for doing that. It's just really exciting to hear about good science being done around mindfulness. And of course, understanding there are variables one can't control. There's never perfect science. There's only the best we can do. So one of the things I wanted to ask you is, what was it that you were really interested? Why is this important to you to do a study that's over a longer period of time? Why is that important?
I think any kind of intervention study like this has to depend on self-selection. You can't force people to take a mindfulness course. Right. That's sort of contradictory. So people self-select for the study. And that could mean one of several things, but it probably means that they feel a need for a stress reduction course. So you might assume that they would be perhaps scoring higher than the average students, or the students that didn't attend, that didn't self-select. You might assume that. And also, you know that if you do an intervention, it doesn't really matter what you do, you will always have an effect. So you could do anything, and there will be an effect. That is in a way a scientific fact.
Yes, yes.
And you can't get away from that. But that effect which you will have will usually reduce itself over time.
And that's why it's so important to have good controls over what we're studying, to make sure it's not just the simple fact that they're in a study and doing something.
Yes, exactly. So we wanted to look at are there any long-term results? Because our understanding of the intervention was that it brings about a change in perspective. And if that was true, then you might see results that actually keep or increase over time if you look at the right things.
So after 6 years, what did you see? What were the results?
The results are very interesting, really very interesting. And we have published the first paper, and we are publishing 2 more papers on the 6-year follow-up. But what we saw is that 6 years down the line, using an intention to treat principle in the analysis, which means that everybody is in there and accounted for, even though they drop out of the study, we saw that 6 years down the line, there is a significantly higher score on well-being in the intervention group than in the control group. And what is perhaps more interesting is that we saw that the way students report to cope with stress and life challenges, that changed in a differential way in the intervention group versus the control group. And what we saw was, you can broadly categorize coping in 2 groups. One you can call approach coping, which is going towards the problem, trying to address it, trying to see what you can learn from it. How can it be handled? Or who can help you to handle it? So it's in a way an active way of meeting life. And the other is what you might call an avoidance-based coping, which is trying to get away from what is uncomfortable, what is threatening, what feels not right, either through aversion, through sort of fantasizing, or other versions of avoidance, getting away. And what we saw was that the students that had taken the course had a gradual increase in problem-based focus, problems-based coping,
Mm-hmm.
approaching the problem, and they had a lessening of aversion-based, while we didn't see this in the control group. They actually had a slight increase in aversion and no change in approach over time.
So for you, what fascinates you about these results? What does that indicate to you?
We have analyzed them further, and this will come out in the last paper, and it shows that it is what you can call positive reappraisal. That is the essence of the change. And that is learning to meet things as something you can grow by
Mm-hmm.
or benefit by, and not something you need to feel threatened by and avoid. And what we saw was that this factor explained nearly all the difference in well-being 6 years down the line.
Mm.
And it is not so difficult to understand, because if you are able to meet your life challenges, stay with them, see what they can teach you, grow through it, then you feel better.
Right. It seems there's a shifting and transition. See if this makes sense to you from the results you're seeing. That there is, as you mentioned, a gradual change from avoidance to encountering stress. And that the shift here is in this reframing you mentioned, one's practicing over time, seeing things as they are. It's in fact a little bit difficult to avoid things. It's difficult to avoid when your practice is seeing and exploring. And to me, it sounds like there's a gradual shift in starting from a point of stressors in one's life to being received as EU stress, positive stress, that it's something that in fact is an exercise that grows one's resiliency, and not a way of shutting off, but a way of coping and managing. And of course, I would see that as increasing one's well-being.
You're quite right. It's a good way of explaining it. And there is one other thing that was very interesting. We saw after the course that the students that had best effect were the students that scored highest on neuroticism scale.
Hmm.
And neuroticism is cognitive and emotional vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
So you are vulnerable, you take things seriously, you criticize yourself, you're on guard. And it was very very encouraging to see that those students who scored high on that actually benefited more. And then what we have seen over the 6 years in the intervention group is that the scores on neuroticism have gradually dropped.
Hmm.
And we are to publish those results shortly.
Wonderful. Well, please do send me a link when that's published as well, and I can add it to the episode page for this episode. So let's shift a little bit into just the very topic of longitudinal studies, and that they can show effects over time, or perhaps the lack of effects over time is also something that may come up in one's studies. And I'm wondering what some of the challenges that people run into in just executing a longitudinal studies. Why don't we see more longitudinal studies out there?
I think that most studies are done by people who get a grant, and the grant is awarded for perhaps 1 to 3 years. But I was very fortunate because I had a job that allowed me to work on this as part of my job. So I didn't need a grant to follow up the students. I could do that as part of my job. But most people that do mindfulness research do not have that possibility.
Yeah.
So I think that is the main reason. And also, the other reason is it is difficult to get people to sign up for a longitudinal study,
Yeah.
but it is not impossible. I don't know whether you're aware of that, but I've been very interested in the adult development study at Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
It started in 1938 and it's still going on.
Mm-hmm.
And every other year they follow up the people in the study. So it is possible, but it really, you really need a strong research organization to manage to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that it's you're given a grant that it has a start and an end, and that's usually very small. It's just this one study because there's I think perhaps a very subtle assumption or a non-questioning of duration, that it's assumed that, oh, well, it's this program that you're doing, so that's the time bounding you have, without as much consideration to but what might we learn if this is extended? And of course, challenges that come up with it are financing for that, because there are research involved over the course of years, as well as the transitions that researchers may experience during that time, let alone people that you don't have locked up in a basement somewhere. Your participants, they are out in the world, and you may have some movement there as well.
Absolutely. So it is challenging, but I think that there is one other aspect, and that is we live in a culture that has a very short time frame for nearly everything we do.
Yes.
So people want quick results. They want to publish quick results, and nobody really takes the time to consider if you are doing something that has a developmental effect, that actually changes the way you are as a human being. If you want to see effects of that down the line, you have to be in it for a long time.
Right. And this echoes, and I think I brought this up on the last podcast interview as well, is the importance of good teacher education, mindfulness teacher education, in that there was a recent paper which described the competency of teachers wasn't that important when you looked at it. And I would assume that if you have really good teachers and okay teachers, however that's measured, and there are, thanks to our friends at Exeter and Oxford and Bangor, an MBI teacher assessment criteria. So we do have some means. That's a good way to look at that. But if you do an intervention, it's just the one program, it may be that some very important directions have been set that will not manifest at the end of 6 weeks or 8 weeks, that it may take several years for how's it look, for example, 6 years later with this really well-rated teacher versus one who is just beginning, and what happened? What effects are we seeing over a large body of participants over time? Evolution doesn't happen in a generation or two.
I think that is very true. And I think my experience of teaching mindfulness for many years is that it's really modeling. You try to be mindful yourself, teaching, and that is not easy. But if you really try to do that, then I'm sure it has a different effect than just teaching it as a technique.
Yeah, and that's such a challenge. Is I'm going to teach you some things that may be received as techniques. And sure, there are things you do, but this is more about how you live your life, how you meet the world. And it's inseparable from you, how you are. And that's a very hard message to wrap your head around at the beginning of, you're going to take this program for a few weeks.
I quite agree. And I think that the development of MBCT is a good example of that. How they
Yes.
first started out without practicing and didn't get particular results. And they contacted Kabat-Zinn and he said, "Are you practicing yourself?" And they said, "No, we're not." Well,
I may have found something here. So, Michael, I also want to ask, as we're on this topic more broadly of mindfulness, not just in your study and your teaching over the years, but I'm very curious from your perspective, what else would you like to explore in mindfulness? What are some things that you're curious about, either that you're working on yourself or you would like to see some work on?
What I would really like to see is that we have now set up internet-based training program where we try and create a community, a virtual community, and every fortnight there are between 20 and 40 people meditating together from different parts of Norway. And then we have a dialogue on the practice and on challenges. And every week we send out a podcast stimulating the people to continue their practice. And I would be very interested to see, is that kind of community, is it effective?
Yeah. Yeah. And how do we mean effective, and what are the boundaries of community? Yeah.
Yeah. And does it help people to stay on course? Because
How long have you been doing that?
for 6 months.
Well, I can share that through another organization that I've founded, and we have links to this on Present Moment. Folks who are listening to this podcast are probably familiar with our practice circle, which my colleague and friend Mark Nickelbein hosts. And we've occasionally brought in co-teachers. So I have taught, my friend Amy Ballantyne, Saki Santorelli has also been there, and Meg Chung and others have taught. And it's twice a month on Sunday evenings. It's entirely online. We've been going for over 5 years now. And although it is a small online community, it is nonetheless a very persistent online community. Is growing a bit more. It's an incremental. It's a very slow growing, but a healthy growing one. So the closeness of those who have been there for years, and not just the connection with one another, but the practice itself and exploring it, because we do different things. In fact, that does lead to building of viable communities. And I will say for the listeners and for you, of course, consider the source. I'm the manager of online programming. I have a certain bias, which I recognize. And it comes from confidence born out of experience, starting with curiosity.
Yes. I think in a way, in the world we live in, we have to try and use the technological advances in a positive way.
Yes.
And my sense, especially in a country like Norway, where people live scarcely around in a very long country, for them to be able to join up and meet again the same people over and over again and hear their queries, their answers, I think it could be, I'm sure it is beneficial from what they tell us, but it would be very interesting to somebody carrying out research on that.
Yes. I agree. I think that would be wonderful. Maybe we will. Michael, is there anything else you'd like to share with the listeners?
No, I think, there are lots of things, but I think that it's enough for now,
Enough for
really.
today.
Yeah.
All right. Well, for those who are listening to this episode, again, I'll be linking to pages that says more about Michael's work, as well as a few other things for you. Our guest today, Michael Wiebe. Michael, thank you so much for being here. Pleasure speaking with you.
The same. Thank you for hosting. Thank you. And all the very best to you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.